The courtroom fell silent as Judge Miranda Reynolds stopped mid-sentence, staring at the disheveled black man standing before her. "Marcus Washington," she whispered, her voice trembling. The homeless veteran's eyes widened in recognition. 20 seconds later, every person in that courtroom was on their feet. Before we dive into this extraordinary story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. If this kind of real-life drama interests you, hit that like button and subscribe to stay updated on more powerful stories of justice, redemption, and long-overdue recognition. Now let's go back to where it all began and discover how a routine trespassing case transformed into one of the most remarkable courtroom moments in recent history. The bitter January wind howled through the abandoned buildings of North Philadelphia, driving sleet sideways and sending temperatures plummeting below 20 degrees. For most residents, this meant cranking up the heat and adding an extra blanket. For 72-year-old Marcus Washington, it meant the difference between life and death. The elderly black veteran had been wandering the streets since the city shelter reached capacity at sundown. With frostbite already numbing his fingers and hypothermia, a real possibility, Marcus spotted the condemned West Side Development building with its broken back window. It wasn't the first time he'd sought refuge in the dilapidated structure. The building had been empty for 3 years, another casualty of stalled gentrification. Marcus slipped through the opening, careful not to cut himself on the jagged glass. Inside, the air was still frigid, but at least dry. He made his way to a corner he'd claimed during previous storms, unwrapping the layers of newspaper he used for insulation. From his meager possessions, Marcus pulled out a tattered wool blanket and a small tarnished medal he kept wrapped in a handkerchief. The metal caught what little moonlight filtered through the broken windows as he rubbed it between his fingers, a ritual that connected him to a past when his country claimed to value him. His moment of peace was shattered by the blinding beam of flashlights and the crackling of police radios. "Philadelphia PD. Come out with your hands up." Marcus slowly raised his arthritic hands, the medal still clutched in his right palm. 2 officers approached, weapons drawn despite the obvious frailty of the elderly man before them. "Got another one," Blake said, the younger officer, to his partner. Dispatch said neighbors reported movement inside. Officer Blake Peterson holstered his weapon and roughly grabbed Marcus by the arm, yanking him to his feet. At 6'2", with cold blue eyes, Peterson had a reputation in the department for his aggressive handling of what he called urban situations. He'd been the subject of 3 excessive force complaints in the past year alone, all filed by black residents, all dismissed. Well, what do we have here? Another black vagrant making himself at home where he doesn't belong," Peterson sneered, tightening his grip until Marcus winced in pain. "Sir, I'm a veteran," Marcus explained, his voice steady despite his circumstances. "It's below freezing out there and the shelters are full. I wasn't hurting anything." Peterson's partner, Officer Ramirez, looked uncomfortable but said nothing as Peterson continued his rough handling. "Yeah, right. Every junkie and bum claims they're a vet when they get caught." Peterson noticed the metal object in Marcus's hand and snatched it away. "Probably stole this, too." Marcus lunged forward. "That's mine. A medal from Vietnam. Please." His protest earned him a shove against the wall. "Resisting arrest now, are we?" Peterson smirked as he pocketed the medal. "Add that to the charges." They handcuffed Marcus, his arthritic shoulders screaming in pain as his arms were wrenched behind his back. At the precinct, Marcus was photographed, fingerprinted, and placed in a holding cell with 3 other men. The concrete bench offered no comfort to his aging body. A public defender named Jessica Chen arrived around midnight, looking exhausted as she flipped through his file. "Mr. Washington, I'm Jessica Chen. I've been assigned to your case," she said, not quite making eye contact. "Trespassing and resisting arrest. The arraignment is tomorrow morning." Marcus leaned forward. "Miss, I need to get my medal back." Officer Peterson took it. "It's all I have left." Something in his dignified tone made Jessica look up from her papers. "I'll see what I can do, but honestly, items taken during arrest are usually held as evidence until after trial." She paused, studying him more carefully. "Your intake form says you're a veteran." Marcus nodded. "Vietnam. 173rd Airborne Brigade. Served 2 tours from 68 to 71. Jessica made a note. "That might help. The judge might show leniency given your service and age." She stood to leave, then hesitated. Do you have anyone who can help with bail if it's set? Family Marcus looked away. No, ma'am. Not anymore. After she left, Marcus settled into the corner of the cell, his body aching from the cold and rough handling. He closed his eyes not to sleep, but to retreat into memories. He saw rice paddies and jungle canopies, heard the whump 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 of helicopter blades, and the screams of wounded men. He remembered carrying Lieutenant Hargrove through enemy territory for 3 days, both of them bleeding, both determined to make it home. And he remembered coming back to a country that had no place for a black hero. The promises made to veterans like him evaporated when faced with the reality of his skin color. No loans for education, no mortgage assistance, no priority hiring. Just decades of struggle, an ongoing battle with PTSD, lost jobs, a crumbled marriage, and eventually the streets. As morning approached, Marcus Washington sat straight-backed despite his exhaustion. Tomorrow he would face a judge, another figure of authority in a system that had failed him repeatedly. But he would face them as he always had, with the dignity they had never managed to strip away from him. The Philadelphia County Courthouse loomed like a fortress, its stone facade weathered by over a century of judgment. For Marcus Washington, shuffling through its corridors in handcuffs and an orange jumpsuit, the building represented yet another system designed to intimidate rather than serve people who looked like him. The holding area outside Courtroom 4B was crowded with the night's arrests, predominantly black and brown faces, most looking resigned to whatever fate awaited them. Marcus sat quietly observing the weary dance of the criminal justice system. Young public defenders hurried between clients, offering 5-minute consultations before life-altering hearings. Court officers moved defendants like cattle barking orders with practiced indifference. Jessica Chen appeared looking marginally more rested than the night before, clutching a stack of files against her chest. "Mr. Washington, your case is up soon. Standard procedure for first appearances. The judge will read the charges, will enter a plea, and bail will be discussed." She lowered her voice. "I checked about your medal. It's in evidence lockup. We can file a motion for its return, but honestly that usually happens after case disposition." Marcus nodded, hiding his disappointment. That medal was his talisman, his one connection to a time when his life had meaning and purpose. The bailiff called his name, and Marcus rose with as much dignity as his stiff joints allowed. Courtroom 4B was presided over by Judge Miranda Reynolds, a stern-faced white woman in her early 50s, with impeccably styled blonde hair and a reputation for being tough on what she called quality-of-life crimes. Her bench sat elevated above the proceedings, a physical reminder of her authority. As Marcus took his place beside Jessica, he noted how the judge barely glanced at him, just another face in the parade of defendants. "Case number 4325, Commonwealth versus Marcus Washington," the court clerk announced. "Charges are criminal trespass and resisting arrest." The prosecutor, Richard Hoffman, a middle-aged man with the confident demeanor of someone who won cases for a living, stepped forward. "Your Honor, the defendant was found illegally occupying private property owned by West Side Development Corporation. When confronted by officers, he became combative. The state recommends bail be set at $5,000 to ensure the defendant's appearance at trial and to send a message about the seriousness of property crimes in our city." Jessica stepped forward. "Your Honor, my client is 72 years old with no prior criminal record. He's a Vietnam veteran who sought shelter during dangerous weather conditions when the city shelters were at capacity. The building in question has been abandoned for years. As for resisting arrest, Mr. Washington simply reached for a personal item of sentimental value, a military medal that was taken during his arrest. We request release on his own recognizance." Judge Reynolds barely looked up from her papers. "Miss Chen, while I appreciate the creative narrative, trespassing is trespassing. The ownership status of the property is irrelevant to the charges." She finally glanced at Marcus. "Defendant, please state your full name and date of birth for the record." Marcus straightened his shoulders, the military discipline still ingrained after all these years. "Marcus Demetrius Washington, born April 10, 1952, Your Honor." The judge nodded absently, making a note. "And service number." This was an unusual request, but Marcus responded automatically. "RA 11-9-70426, United States Army 173rd Airborne Brigade, ma'am." Judge Reynolds froze her pen, hovering above her notepad. Her eyes suddenly wide and focused locked onto Marcus's face. "Did you say the 173rd under Colonel James Reynolds?" The courtroom, accustomed to the rapid-fire processing of cases, grew silent at this unexpected turn. Marcus studied the judge's face recognition slowly dawning. "Yes, ma'am. Colonel Reynolds was my commanding officer during my second tour. Jim Reynolds from Virginia." Something unreadable flashed across Judge Reynolds' face. She abruptly stood. "This court will take a 30-minute recess." Without further explanation, she disappeared through the door behind her bench, leaving a confused courtroom in her wake. The prosecutor turned to Jessica with raised eyebrows. "What was that about?" Jessica shook her head, equally baffled. "I have no idea." As they waited, an elderly white bailiff with a Vietnam veteran pin on his uniform approached Marcus. "Did I hear right you were with the 173rd Airborne, the Sky Soldiers?" Marcus nodded. "2 tours. 68 to 71. The bailiff's demeanor changed instantly, respect replacing the professional detachment. "I was with the 1st Cav, 69 to 70. You boys saw some of the worst of it." He lowered his voice. "The 173rd had those special ops running with the Mac V SOG, didn't they?" Marcus neither confirmed nor denied the secrecy of those missions still binding decades later. The bailiff seemed to understand. "Say no more, brother. Say no more." He patted Marcus's shoulder before returning to his post, leaving Jessica even more confused. "Mr. Washington, what exactly is happening here?" Before Marcus could answer, he was hit with a sudden, vivid flashback, the kind that had plagued him for decades. The jungle heat, the whir of helicopter blades, the weight of Colonel Reynolds on his back, as Marcus carried him through enemy territory, both men bleeding, both determined to make it home. The colonel's voice weak but insistent. "If we make it out, Washington, I'm putting you up for the Medal of Honor. No matter what they say about decorating you boys." The memory was so powerful that Marcus momentarily forgot where he was. When he returned to the present, Jessica was staring at him with concern. "Are you all right? You went somewhere else just now." Marcus nodded, composing himself. "Just remembering things best forgotten, Miss Chen." As they waited for Judge Reynolds to return, Marcus couldn't help but wonder what connection she might have to the colonel whose life he had saved all those years ago, and whether that connection would matter in a system that had consistently failed to recognize his humanity. In her private chambers, Judge Miranda Reynolds frantically pulled open the bottom drawer of her desk, reaching for a worn leather photo album she kept locked away. Her hands trembled as she leafed through pages of family history, past childhood photos and wedding snapshots, until she reached the section labeled Dad, Vietnam. There it was, the photograph she remembered from her childhood. Her father, Colonel James Reynolds, standing beside a young black soldier in jungle fatigues, both men exhausted but smiling weakly for the camera. The colonel's arm was in a sling, his uniform stained with what she now understood had been blood. On the back, in her father's precise handwriting, with Sergeant Washington, "The man who carried me through hell. Da nang, 19 Tubulu." Miranda sank into her chair, memories flooding back. Her father's stories about Vietnam had been rare and carefully edited for his young daughter's ears. But one story he told repeatedly, with increasing frequency as he battled the cancer that would eventually take his life. The tale of the brave sergeant who had carried him for 3 days through enemy territory after their helicopter was shot down. "That man had every reason to leave me behind," her father had said during one of their final conversations. White officer, black sergeant in a war where black soldiers were dying at higher rates and being recognized less. But he wouldn't leave me. Carried me on his back, kept my wounds clean, shared his last water. I'd be in a jungle grave if not for Marcus Washington. Miranda remembered how her father had tried to find Marcus after the war, sending letters that went unanswered, making phone calls that led nowhere. The military bureaucracy and the chaos of the immediate post-Vietnam era had made it impossible. Her father died in 1987, still expressing regret that he'd never properly thanked the man who saved his life. And now, by some twist of fate, that very man stood in her courtroom homeless and charged with trespassing. The bitter irony was almost too much to bear. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Your Honor." It's been 30 minutes, her clerk said tentatively. Miranda wiped away tears she hadn't realized were falling. Thank you, Thomas. I'll be right out. She carefully returned the photo album to the drawer, locked it, and composed herself. Before leaving her chambers, she made a quick phone call to an old family friend who had maintained military connections. Meanwhile, in the courtroom, Jessica Chen had been busy on her phone researching Marcus Washington's military history. What she found left her stunned. Mr. Washington, why didn't you tell me you were awarded the Silver Star for valor in combat, and that you were recommended for the Medal of Honor? Marcus shrugged, the movement barely perceptible. Didn't seem relevant to a trespassing charge, ma'am. Besides, they downgraded the recommendation. Happened a lot to soldiers who looked like me. Jessica scrolled through more information. It says here, you were wounded twice, received a Purple Heart, and... She paused, reading more carefully. Wait, there's a note that your Medal of Honor recommendation was downgraded under unusual circumstances with a classified addendum. Do you know what that means? Before Marcus could respond, Judge Reynolds returned to the bench. The courtroom rose as protocol demanded, but something had changed. The judge's earlier brisk efficiency was gone, replaced by a thoughtful solemnity. Be seated, she said, her voice carrying a weight it hadn't before. She looked directly at Marcus, seeing him truly for the first time. Mr. Washington, I find myself in an unusual position. I must recuse myself from your case due to a personal connection. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Judge Reynolds continued. It appears that the defendant once served under my late father, Colonel James Reynolds, in Vietnam. More significantly, according to military records and my father's personal accounts, Sergeant Washington saved my father's life during combat operations in 1970, carrying him through enemy territory for 3 days. After their helicopter was shot down, the courtroom fell completely silent. Every eye turned to Marcus, who sat straight-backed, his expression unchanged. Before I transfer this case to another judge, I want to state for the record that Sergeant Washington was recommended for the Medal of Honor for his actions, a recommendation that was inexplicably downgraded. My father spent years trying to contact Sergeant Washington to thank him personally without success. Judge Reynolds paused, visibly emotional. The fact that a man who served his country with such distinction now stands before this court homeless and charged with seeking shelter during life-threatening weather is a shameful reflection on our system's failure to honor its commitments to veterans, particularly veterans of color. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably. Several reporters who had been half asleep in the back row were now frantically taking notes. Judge Reynolds addressed the court clerk. This case will be transferred to Judge William Hargrove in courtroom 3 amperes. Until then, the defendant is to be released on his own recognizance. She turned to the bailiff. Please ensure that Mr. Washington's personal effects, including his military medal, are returned to him immediately. As Judge Reynolds gathered her papers, she made one final statement. Mr. Washington, my father, spoke of you often. He told me you were the bravest man he ever knew. He would be heartbroken to see you here today. With that, she left the bench, leaving a courtroom in shock, and a story that would soon explode across local media. Do you think Judge Reynolds made the right decision to recuse herself, or should she have used her position to immediately dismiss the charges? Comment number 1. If you believe she should have stayed on the case to help Marcus, or number 2, if her recusal was the professionally correct choice. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe for more stories about justice and redemption. The courtroom drama was far from over, but with Judge Reynolds' revelation, the case had transformed from a routine trespassing charge into something much more significant. How would the new judge handle this case, now that Marcus Washington's heroism was public knowledge? And what secrets still remained about why his Medal of Honor recommendation was downgraded? The answers would soon emerge, with consequences none of the participants could foresee. The news of Marcus Washington's identity and Judge Reynolds' recusal spread like wildfire through the Philadelphia courthouse. By afternoon, local reporters crowded the hallways, and the story had begun appearing on social media feeds with headlines like, "Homeless Hero Vietnam Vet Who Saved Colonel Now on Trial." Marcus, unused to attention after decades of invisibility, found himself suddenly visible in the most uncomfortable way. Court officers escorted him to courtroom 3 Amperes, where his case had been reassigned to Judge William Hargrove. Jessica walked beside him, briefing him on what to expect. Judge Hargrove has a complicated reputation, she said carefully. He's one of the few black judges in the county system appointed during the last administration. He's known for being exceptionally tough, especially on black defendants. Marcus raised an eyebrow. One of those pull yourself up by your bootstraps types who thinks we all need to try harder, Jessica nodded. Exactly. He calls it tough love. Critics call it internalized racism. Either way, don't expect any special treatment because you share a racial identity. The courtroom was already packed when they arrived. Judge William Hargrove presided with a stern demeanor that matched his reputation. In his early 60s, with closely cropped gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses, he ran his courtroom with military precision, fitting for a man who had risen from poverty to earn degrees from Howard University and Harvard Law through ROTC and military service. The judge studied Marcus with unreadable eyes as Jessica approached the bench. Your Honor, given the circumstances revealed this morning and my client's service record, we request that all charges be dismissed in the interest of justice. Richard Hoffman, the prosecutor, immediately objected. Your Honor, while Mr. Washington's military service is admirable, it doesn't exempt him from the law. Furthermore, we've amended the charges based on Officer Peterson's full report. He slid a document across to Jessica and the judge. We're adding charges of assaulting a peace officer and possession of stolen property, specifically a military decoration that Officer Peterson believes was not lawfully obtained. Jessica stared at him in disbelief. That's absurd. The medal is his. And there was no assault. Judge Hargrove raised a hand to silence them both. Miss Chen, the Commonwealth has the right to amend charges before trial. Mr. Hoffman, these new allegations seem conveniently timed given the publicity this case has suddenly received. He studied the documents carefully. I'll allow the amended charges, but I'm setting trial for next Monday. That gives both sides time to prepare properly. He looked at Marcus. Given the defendant's age, service record, and lack of flight risk, he will remain released on his own recognizance. However, he must report daily to pre-trial services. As Marcus and Jessica prepared to leave, a woman burst through the courtroom doors. Wait, I need to speak to Marcus Washington. All heads turned to see a well-dressed black woman in her 40s, her expression a mixture of determination and distress. Marcus's eyes widened in recognition. Clara, Judge Hargrove banged his gavel. Ma'am, you cannot disrupt these proceedings. Who are you? The woman straightened her shoulders. I'm Clara Washington Jones, the defendant's daughter. I just saw the news report. Judge Hargrove's expression softened slightly. Miss Jones, you can speak with your father and his attorney outside my courtroom. We're adjourned until Monday at 9 a.m. Outside in the hallway, Clara stood awkwardly before her father, 15 years of silence between them like an invisible wall. Dad, she finally said, her voice cracking slightly, when I saw your face on the news, I couldn't believe it. Marcus reached out hesitantly, then dropped his hand. Clara, you look so much like your mother. The resemblance to his late wife was startling. The same determined chin, the same intelligent eyes. Clara didn't move to embrace him. I'm not here for a reunion, Dad, but I couldn't just do nothing when I saw what was happening. She turned to Jessica. I'm a social worker at Veterans Affairs. I can help with his case and finding appropriate housing. Jessica nodded gratefully. That would be incredibly helpful. There's clearly more going on with these charges than a simple trespassing case. As they moved to a quieter corner, Clara explained her long absence from her father's life. After Mom died, your PTSD got worse. You were drinking, having nightmares, disappearing for days. I was 16, scared and angry. When you left that last time, I decided it was better to believe you abandoned us than to wonder if you were dead somewhere. She looked away. By the time I was old enough to understand what war does to people, especially black veterans who were denied proper support, I couldn't find you. Marcus listened silently, his face a mask of regret. I never stopped loving you, Clara. I just couldn't bring my darkness into your life. Your mother made me promise before she passed that if I couldn't get better, I'd stay away rather than drag you down with me. Clara's professional composure cracked slightly. That wasn't your decision to make. We could have faced it together. The conversation paused as Jessica returned from consulting with a colleague. "I've been researching Officer Peterson," she said grimly. "He has a history of complaints for excessive force primarily against black men. 3 in the past year alone, all dismissed. And there's something else. The West Side Development Corporation that owns the building where Mr. Washington was arrested. Their CEO plays golf with Judge Hargrove every Sunday." Clara's eyes narrowed. "That's a clear conflict of interest. The judge should recuse himself." Jessica sighed. "It's not that simple. The connection isn't direct enough to force recusal, and Judge Hargrove isn't likely to step aside voluntarily. He prides himself on being impartial, regardless of personal connections." The conversation shifted to trial strategy. Clara offered to testify about her father's PTSD and the systemic barriers he had faced as a black veteran. Jessica welcomed her help, but cautioned that the prosecutor seemed determined to make an example of Marcus, especially now that the case had gained media attention. As Monday approached, the trial preparation intensified. Clara used her VA connections to access her father's full military and medical records, revealing a history of denied benefits and inadequate treatment. Jessica filed motions to exclude Officer Peterson's enhanced report and to dismiss the additional charges. Marcus, meanwhile, found himself housed temporarily in a veterans facility, the first real bed he'd slept in for months. The irony wasn't lost on him. It had taken an arrest and media attention to get the services he'd been entitled to for decades. When Monday arrived, Courtroom 3 Amperes was packed with spectators, including veterans advocates, reporters, and curious courthouse staff. Officer Blake Peterson sat behind the prosecutor, projecting confidence despite the increased scrutiny. As Judge Hargrove called the court to order, Marcus noticed how the judge avoided eye contact with him, focusing instead on the paperwork before him. "Commonwealth versus Marcus Washington," Judge Hargrove announced. "The defendant is charged with criminal trespass, assaulting a peace officer, and possession of stolen property." "How does the defendant plead?" Jessica stood. "Not guilty to all charges, Your Honor." Judge Hargrove nodded curtly. "Mr. Hoffman, you may present the Commonwealth's case." The prosecutor called Officer Peterson as his first witness. Peterson took the stand with practiced ease, recounting a version of events that painted Marcus as belligerent and potentially dangerous. "The suspect became agitated when we instructed him to vacate the premises," Peterson testified. "When I attempted to escort him outside, he grabbed my arm and resisted, forcing me to restrain him for officer safety." Jessica noted Marcus's hands clenching into fists as the officer continued his fabricated account. "During the arrest, I discovered what appeared to be a military medal in his possession. Based on my military family background, it looked authentic, but it seemed unlikely that the suspect had earned such a decoration legitimately." Judge Hargrove, who had been taking notes, looked up sharply. "Officer Peterson, are you suggesting that the defendant's military record is fraudulent despite Department of Defense confirmation of his service and decorations?" Peterson backpedaled slightly. "I'm simply stating that at the time of arrest I had no way to verify the medal's provenance, Your Honor." Jessica stood for cross-examination, her preparation evident in her confident approach. "Officer Peterson, you testified that Mr. Washington grabbed your arm and resisted arrest. Where exactly in your initial police report is this alleged assault documented?" Peterson shifted uncomfortably. "It may not be explicitly stated," but Jessica pressed on. "In fact, your initial report only mentions trespassing with no reference to any physical resistance. This assault only appeared in your supplemental report filed after Judge Reynolds publicly recognized Mr. Washington's heroism. Isn't that correct?" Before Peterson could answer, Judge Hargrove interrupted. "Miss Chen, please allow the witness to respond before asking your next question." Jessica nodded, but the damage was done. Peterson's credibility had been questioned, and surprisingly, Judge Hargrove himself seemed to be watching the officer with increased skepticism. As the first day of trial concluded, an unexpected dynamic was emerging. Despite his reputation for harshness, Judge Hargrove appeared troubled by inconsistencies in the prosecution's case. The judge's final comments before adjournment suggested as much. "Officer Peterson, you'll return tomorrow for continued cross-examination. I expect clear, consistent testimony about these events." He looked at the medal that had been entered into evidence. Marcus's silver star. And I would advise against speculating about the legitimacy of military decorations without substantial evidence. This court takes such matters very seriously. As the courtroom cleared, Clara whispered to her father, "Something's bothering the judge about this case. More than he's letting on." Marcus nodded, watching Judge Hargrove's retreating figure. "That man is carrying something heavy. I recognize the look." The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as Jessica Chen arrived for the second day of trial, clutching a thick folder of newly discovered documents. She had spent the night working with Clara Washington, digging through military archives and veterans' advocacy reports. What they uncovered had kept them working until dawn, fueled by disbelief and growing outrage. Jessica found Marcus waiting in the conference room, looking better than he had days before. Regular meals and a safe place to sleep had brought some color back to his face, though decades of hardship couldn't be erased so quickly. "We found something, Mr. Washington," Jessica said, spreading documents across the table. Clara accessed reports through her VA connections that show a pattern of discrimination in how Vietnam veterans' benefits were distributed. She pointed to statistical analyses spanning from 1971 to 1980. Black veterans were systematically denied GI Bill benefits, VA housing loans, and adequate medical treatment for PTSD at rates far higher than their white counterparts. "Your rejections weren't bad luck or isolated incidents. They were part of a pattern." Marcus nodded, unsurprised. "We knew it was happening, just couldn't prove it." Jessica continued. "Clara also found your original Medal of Honor recommendation, signed by Colonel Reynolds. It includes details of the mission that aren't in your public record." She lowered her voice. "It mentions you were part of something called Project Gamma, attached to MACV-SOG. The mission details are still heavily redacted, but it's clear your unit was primarily composed of black soldiers and was assigned extraordinarily dangerous operations." Marcus's expression remained unchanged, but his eyes took on a distant look. "They called us the Ghost Squad, unofficially. Mostly black and Hispanic soldiers. They sent us where they didn't want to send white boys. Higher casualty rates, fewer medals, almost no recognition when we got home." Jessica hesitated before sharing the next discovery. "We also found this." She slid across a memo from 1971, partially redacted but with the essential text intact. "Recommend downgrade of Washington M. Decoration from MOH to SS due to concerns about public reception and potential racial tensions given ongoing civil rights activities stateside. Subject's actions meet MOH criteria, but recognition at this level deemed politically problematic at this time." Marcus read it silently, then looked up with a bitter smile. "Always suspected something like this. Now I know." Jessica wasn't finished. "There's more. We submitted a records request for Officer Peterson's body camera footage from your arrest. The department initially claimed it was unavailable, but Clara's friend in Internal Affairs found it. We have a copy, and it completely contradicts Peterson's testimony." The door opened, and Clara entered looking professional in a charcoal suit despite her obvious fatigue. "I also ran a property search on that abandoned building," she said. "Westside Development Corporation purchased it 4 years ago for a fraction of its value through a city program meant to revitalize neglected neighborhoods. They promised affordable housing, but haven't done any work on it. The company is owned by RHC Holdings, which is primarily owned by Robert Hargrove Campbell." Jessica and Marcus both looked up sharply. "Any relation to our judge?" Jessica asked. Clara nodded grimly. "Judge William Hargrove's brother-in-law. They both served in Vietnam, different units, different years. I haven't found a direct connection to Dad's case yet, but it's definitely a conflict of interest the judge didn't disclose." When court resumed that afternoon, the dynamics had shifted noticeably. Jessica approached the bench before proceedings began, requesting a sidebar conference with the judge and prosecutor. "Your Honor," she said quietly, "I've discovered information suggesting you have a potential conflict of interest in this case. Westside Development Corporation, whose property is central to the trespassing charge, is owned by your brother-in-law's holding company." Judge Hargrove's expression hardened. "Mrs. Chen, my wife's brother's business dealings are not relevant to my ability to judge this case impartially." Jessica persisted. With respect, Your Honor, judicial ethics require disclosure of such connections. Additionally, both you and Mr. Campbell served in Vietnam. Given the nature of this case and the defendant's military history, these connections create at minimum the appearance of impropriety. The judge's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Jessica continued. Furthermore, we've obtained Officer Peterson's body camera footage, which directly contradicts his sworn testimony yesterday. We've also discovered evidence suggesting racial discrimination played a role in the downgrading of Mr. Washington's Medal of Honor recommendation, which relates directly to the stolen property charge. After a tense moment, Judge Hargrove nodded curtly. I'll review the body camera footage in chambers. Court will recess for 30 minutes. When proceedings resumed, the atmosphere in the courtroom was electric. Judge Hargrove's expression was unreadable as Officer Peterson retook the stand for continued cross-examination. Jessica wasted no time. Officer Peterson, yesterday you testified under oath that Mr. Peterson, Washington physically resisted arrest and grabbed your arm. Is that correct? Peterson nodded confidently. Yes, that's correct. Jessica approached the bench. Your Honor, permission to play Exhibit 14. The body camera footage from Officer Peterson's arrest of Mr. Sekin. Washington Judge Hargrove nodded, his expression grave. Permission granted. The courtroom watched in silence as the footage played on monitors. It showed Marcus Washington, frail and cooperative, being roughly handled by Peterson despite offering no resistance. Peterson's voice could be clearly heard using racial slurs and making derogatory comments about another black vagrant. When Marcus reached for his medal, saying, "Please, that's mine from Vietnam," Peterson was shown shoving him against the wall with unnecessary force, saying, "Yeah, right. Probably stole it from a real soldier." By the time the video ended, murmurs filled the courtroom. Several jurors were openly glaring at Peterson. The officer himself had visibly paled. Jessica turned to him. Officer Peterson, do you want to revise your testimony in light of this evidence? Peterson looked to the prosecutor for help, but Hoffman was staring straight ahead, clearly distancing himself from his witness. I may have misremembered the exact sequence of events, Peterson stammered. Jessica wasn't finished. She methodically introduced evidence of Peterson's history of excessive force complaints against black citizens, all dismissed without thorough investigation. She then called an expert witness who had analyzed Peterson's arrest records, revealing a pattern of harsher treatment and more serious charges for black suspects compared to white suspects in similar circumstances. As Jessica built her case, the prosecution's narrative continued to unravel. The stolen property charge collapsed when military records confirmed the Silver Star legitimately belonged to Marcus. The assault charge was exposed as fabrication through the body camera footage. Even the trespassing charge weakened when Jessica presented evidence that Westside Development had failed to secure the property properly or post adequate warning signs, while simultaneously neglecting to develop the property as promised to Bridus, the city. By late afternoon, it was clear that Officer Peterson's credibility had been destroyed. Judge Hargrove called both attorneys to the bench. Mr. Hoffman, given the evidence presented, I strongly suggest the Commonwealth reconsider its position in this matter. The prosecutor, recognizing a lost cause, nodded reluctantly. Your Honor, in light of the new evidence, the Commonwealth moves to dismiss all charges against Mr. Washington. Judge Hargrove seemed about to agree when Marcus suddenly spoke up. Your Honor, if I may, I'd prefer to continue with the trial. Everyone turned to stare at the elderly veteran who stood tall despite his years. There are truths that need to be heard in this courtroom, not just about my case, but about what happened to men like me after Vietnam. If the charges are dismissed now, those truths stay buried. I've been silent too long. The judge studied Marcus for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them. Very well, Mr. Washington. The trial will continue. As court adjourned for the day, Clara approached her father. Dad, why did you do that? You could have walked away free and clear. Marcus shook his head. This stopped being about my freedom the moment that body camera footage played. It's about all the Marcus Washingtons who didn't have a daughter at the VA or a judge who knew their commanding officer. It's about truth. Jessica joined them, looking both impressed and concerned. Speaking of truth, there's something odd about Judge Hargrove's reaction to all this. He was clearly disturbed by the evidence against Peterson and the prosecutor's case, but there's something else going on. The way he looks at your medal, Mr. Washington. It's like he recognizes it specifically, not just as a military decoration. Clara nodded thoughtfully. I noticed that too. And I've been researching his background. Judge Hargrove's father was Lieutenant Robert Hargrove, who served with the 173rd Airborne in '69 and '70. He died in Vietnam. Marcus froze the color draining from his face. Robert Hargrove, he whispered. My God. Jessica looked between them. What does that mean? Marcus sank slowly into a chair. The medal. It's not mine. Not really. He looked up at their confused faces. It's time I told the whole truth. About the medal, about Lieutenant Hargrove, and about what really happened in those jungles 55 years ago. The conference room in the courthouse basement felt too small for the weight of the story Marcus Washington prepared to share. Clara sat beside him, while Jessica arranged a voice recorder on the table. If this is relevant to your case, Mr. Washington, we should document it, she explained. Marcus nodded his weathered hands, tracing the outline of the silver star that had been returned to him after the day's proceedings. This medal, he began, tells a story that's been hidden for over 5 decades. He carefully unwrapped the tarnished decoration, revealing an engraving on the back that Jessica hadn't noticed before. Lieutenant R.H. Courage above all. This silver star didn't belong to me originally. It belonged to Lieutenant Robert Hargrove, Judge Hargrove's father. Clara gasped softly, while Jessica leaned forward, realization dawning. That's why the judge kept staring at it, she whispered. Marcus nodded. I was a sergeant with the 173rd Airborne attached to special operations that officially didn't exist. Our unit was primarily black and Hispanic soldiers assigned to the most dangerous missions with minimal support. They called it statistical management, using minority troops for high-risk operations to keep white casualty numbers lower. He paused, collecting memories that remained razor-sharp despite the passing decades. In early '70, we were sent on a classified mission near the Cambodian border. Lieutenant Hargrove was new, one of the few white officers who treated us like men instead of expendable assets. We were ambushed, cut off from extraction. 8 men in our 12-man unit died in the first 20 minutes. Marcus's voice remained steady, but his eyes reflected the horror of that day. Command abandoned us. Said the risk was too high for rescue choppers. Lieutenant Hargrove refused to accept it. He managed to establish radio contact with another unit led by Colonel Reynolds, who agreed to attempt extraction from a different location if we could get there. The mission, Marcus explained, involved a harrowing 3-day journey through enemy territory. Lieutenant Hargrove was wounded early but refused evacuation until all his men were safe. On the 3rd day, we were spotted about a mile from the extraction point. The enemy was closing in. We had wounded men who couldn't move quickly. Marcus paused, the memory visibly painful. Lieutenant Hargrove made a decision. He took his weapon, his ammunition, and a radio, and told me to get the wounded to the extraction point. He said he'd create a diversion to draw enemy forces away from our position. Clara reached for her father's hand as he continued. His last words to me were, Washington, make sure my son knows his father wasn't a coward. Give him this. He handed me his silver star and a letter. Marcus looked directly at Jessica. Lieutenant Hargrove died covering our retreat. His actions saved 5 lives that day. Colonel Reynolds witnessed his sacrifice through binoculars from the helicopter. He recommended me for the Medal of Honor for getting the wounded out, but I knew the real hero was Hargrove. Jessica processed this information, understanding now the deeper currents running beneath the trial. So Judge Hargrove is the son Lieutenant Hargrove never met. Marcus nodded. His wife was pregnant when he deployed. The judge would have been born in late '70 or early '71. Clara frowned. But why didn't you deliver the medal and letter? As he asked. Why keep it all these years? A shadow passed over Marcus's face. I tried. For years I tried. After I returned stateside, I dealt with my own wounds, physical and otherwise. The military wasn't eager to help black veterans transition to civilian life. The promised benefits rarely materialized for us. Still, I kept searching for Hargrove's family. He described a bureaucratic nightmare of incorrect addresses, unreturned phone calls, and administrative barriers. In '75, I finally tracked them to a suburb outside Philadelphia. I went there with the medal and letter still in my army dress uniform, thinking it might help them take me seriously. His voice hardened. Mrs. Hargrove opened the door. When she saw a black man standing there, her expression changed immediately. When I explained who I was and mentioned her husband, she called me a liar. Said there was no way her husband would have entrusted anything to. Well, she used a word I won't repeat. Clara's grip on her father's hand tightened as he continued. She slammed the door in my face. I could hear a child crying inside. That must have been young William. I left the medal and letter in their mailbox, but 2 days later they were returned to my rooming house address with a note saying, "Don't contact this family again." After that, I kept the medal as a reminder of the promise I couldn't keep. Jessica sat back, understanding, washing over her. So Judge Hargrove never knew about his father's last wishes, or the true story of his heroism. And now he's presiding over the trial of the man who was with his father when he died. Marcus nodded solemnly. Life has a way of coming full circle, even if it takes 50 years. The revelation cast the judge's behavior in a new light. His reputation for being exceptionally hard on black defendants might have roots in the story his mother had told him about his father. A story that likely excluded the black soldiers who fought alongside him, or the one who tried to bring his final message home. Jessica considered the legal implications. This connection is even more reason for Judge Hargrove to recuse himself. It's not just his brother-in-law's property anymore. It's a deeply personal connection to you. Marcus shook his head. I don't want him to recuse himself. I want him to hear the truth about his father from the man who was there. He deserves that much. As they discussed next steps, Jessica's phone buzzed with a message from a contact at the VA. Former Judge Miranda Reynolds had been using her connections to investigate why Marcus's Medal of Honor recommendation had been downgraded. The message contained scanned documents showing a disturbing pattern of racial discrimination in military award allocations during Vietnam, with statistics revealing that black soldiers represented 20% of combat troops, but received less than 2% of Medals of Honor awarded during the conflict. This could help explain why your recommendation was downgraded, Jessica explained. Judge Reynolds wants to testify about her findings, if you'll allow it. Before Marcus could respond, another message arrived, this one from the courthouse clerk. Judge Hargrove was requesting an immediate private meeting with Marcus, Jessica, and the prosecutor in his chambers. He knows, Marcus said quietly. Someone must have told him about the medal. The meeting in Judge Hargrove's chambers was tense with unspoken emotions. The judge dismissed the prosecutor after a few minutes, leaving just Marcus, Jessica, and himself. Mr. Washington, Judge Hargrove began, his voice carefully controlled. I've been informed that you served with my father in Vietnam. Marcus met his gaze steadily. Yes, Your Honor. Lieutenant Robert Hargrove was a brave man, one of the finest officers I ever served with. The judge's expression remained impassive, but his knuckles whitened as he gripped his desk. And you claim to have been with him when he died. I don't claim it, sir. I was there. Silence filled the room until Judge Hargrove finally asked the question that had clearly haunted him for decades. How did he die? Marcus told the story again, sparing no detail of Lieutenant Hargrove's courage and sacrifice. When he finished, the judge removed his glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose. My mother told me he died in a helicopter crash, a random accident. She never mentioned other soldiers or a rescue mission. Your mother and I had a difficult encounter when I tried to bring you your father's medal. And last letter, Marcus said carefully. She didn't believe me. Because you're black. It wasn't a question. Judge Hargrove's tone made it clear he understood his mother's racial attitudes all too well. Marcus didn't respond directly. Instead, he reached into his pocket and withdrew the silver star. This belongs to you, Your Honor. Your father wanted you to have it. He wanted you to know he died with courage, saving his men. Judge Hargrove stared at the medal, not reaching for it. Why should I believe you now? This could be a convenient story to influence your case. You don't have to believe me, Marcus replied. But I've carried this medal for 55 years, trying to keep a promise to a man who gave his life for mine and others. I have nothing to gain by lying about it now. After a long moment, Judge Hargrove stood. I need time to consider all of this. Court will resume tomorrow morning. As they left the chambers, Jessica whispered to Marcus, "Do you think he believed you?" Marcus shrugged. Hard to say. But for the first time in his life, he heard the truth about his father. Whether he accepts it is up to him. Do you think Judge Hargrove will believe Marcus's story about his father's heroism, or will his lifetime of prejudice prevent him from accepting the truth? Comment number 1. If you believe the truth will change the judge's perspective, or number 2, if you think deeply ingrained biases are too strong to overcome. And while you're sharing your thoughts, don't forget to like and subscribe to stay updated on more powerful stories of justice, delayed but not denied. The truth about Lieutenant Hargrove's medal had finally been revealed, but would it bridge the racial divide that had shaped his son's worldview, or would it become another casualty in America's long history of racial misunderstanding? As Marcus Washington prepared to face his third day in court, he couldn't help but wonder if the promise he'd made to a dying man might finally be fulfilled after more than 5 decades. By the third day of Marcus Washington's trial, the Philadelphia County Courthouse Plaza had transformed into a forum for competing visions of America. On one side gathered veterans groups, their military caps and patches, displaying service from Vietnam to Afghanistan. Beside them stood civil rights activists, with signs demanding justice for Marcus and Black Veterans Matter. Across the plaza, a smaller but vocal group held counter-protests with messages like "No special treatment" and "Law and order first." Local news vans lined the street, reporters doing live stand-ups with the divided crowd as their backdrop. Inside the courthouse, Clara Washington navigated the growing media circus with determined focus. Her years as a social worker had taught her how to cut through bureaucracy and mobilize resources. Since reuniting with her father, she had channeled her initial shock and hurt into passionate advocacy. "The system failed my father twice," she told a group of young activists who had approached her outside the courtroom. First as a Black soldier returning from Vietnam, and again as a homeless veteran seeking shelter. His story isn't unique, it's just finally being heard. Among those listening was Jamal Lewis, a 26-year-old community organizer who recognized the connections between Marcus's experience and contemporary issues. "This isn't just about what happened 50 years ago," he said. "It's about ongoing discrimination in housing, healthcare, and the justice system. Mr. Washington's case shows how these injustices compound over a lifetime." Clara nodded. "Exactly. That's why we're building a coalition. Veterans groups, housing advocates, racial justice organizations. My father's case is a lens that brings multiple issues into focus." The coalition Clara had hastily assembled was proving remarkably effective. Veterans from across the state had come to show solidarity, many bringing documentation of their own struggles with the VA and other institutions. Civil rights attorneys offered pro bono assistance to Jessica. Housing advocates used the case to highlight Philadelphia's ongoing crisis of homelessness, particularly among veterans of color. When court resumed, the gallery was packed with observers. Judge Hargrove entered looking as though he hadn't slept, his usual commanding presence subdued by whatever internal struggle he'd been waging overnight. He called the attorneys to the bench immediately. "Given yesterday's revelations about my personal connection to the defendant, I've been considering whether to recuse myself," he began. Before Jessica could respond, he continued. "However, after careful reflection and consultation with the Judicial Ethics Committee, I've decided to remain on this case under 2 conditions. First, that both parties consent, and second, that all proceedings from this point forward be transcribed for potential review." Jessica glanced at Marcus, who gave a slight nod. "The defense consents, Your Honor." Richard Hoffman, looking increasingly uncomfortable with his role in the prosecution, also agreed. "Very well," Judge Hargrove said. "Miss Chen, please call your next witness." Jessica had strategically organized the defense testimony to build a comprehensive picture of both Marcus's individual experience and the systemic issues it represented. Her first witness of the day was Dr. Eleanor Richards, a historian specializing in racial disparities in military service. Dr. Richards presented meticulously researched data showing how Black Vietnam veterans had been systematically denied benefits, facing rejection rates 3 times higher than white veterans for GI Bill applications and VA housing loans. The consequences of this discrimination were multi-generational, she testified. While many white veterans used these benefits to attend college, purchase homes, and build wealth they could pass to their children, black veterans were disproportionately left without these opportunities for advancement. As Jessica guided her through statistical evidence, Judge Hargrove paid close attention occasionally, asking clarifying questions that suggested genuine engagement with the information rather than skepticism. The next witness was James Daniels, a white veteran who had served in Marcus's unit. Now in his 70s and using a wheelchair, Daniels had traveled from Ohio after seeing the case on the news. "Sergeant Washington saved my life twice." Over there, he testified, his voice thick with emotion. "First, when he pulled me out of a rice paddy after I was shot, and again when he got us to that extraction point after Lieutenant Hargrove's last stand." Daniels described how differently they were treated upon returning home, despite having served side by side. "We came back on the same transport plane, but our paths diverged completely at the airport. I went home to a parade in my small town, used the GI Bill for college, got a VA loan for my first house. Meanwhile, Marcus couldn't even get his benefits paperwork processed correctly." As Daniels spoke, several veterans in the gallery nodded in recognition of a reality rarely acknowledged so publicly. Jessica then called former Judge Miranda Reynolds, who testified about her investigation into Marcus's downgraded Medal of Honor recommendation. "My father maintained until his death that Sergeant Washington deserved the Medal of Honor for his actions. Recently declassified documents show a pattern of racial bias in how these recommendations were handled. Black soldiers were routinely downgraded regardless of the strength of their commanding officer's recommendations." Throughout the testimony, Officer Blake Peterson sat behind the prosecutor, growing visibly agitated as his case disintegrated. During a court recess, he was overheard in the hallway, making racially charged comments about ungrateful troublemakers trying to rewrite history. When a young black courthouse intern asked him to lower his voice, Peterson responded with a threatening gesture that was captured on several cell phones. The videos quickly circulated online, further inflaming public opinion. By afternoon, the prosecution's case had collapsed so thoroughly that Hoffman made only token cross-examinations. Judge Hargrove, who had been notably engaged throughout the defense presentation, called both attorneys to the bench. "Mr. Hoffman, does the Commonwealth have any substantive rebuttal to these witnesses?" The prosecutor shook his head. "Your Honor, in light of the overwhelming evidence presented by the defense, the Commonwealth moves to dismiss all charges against Mr. Washington in the interest of justice." Judge Hargrove considered this, then turned to Jessica. "Ms. Chen, your response." Jessica consulted briefly with Marcus before answering. "Your Honor, while we appreciate the prosecutor's motion, my client wishes to complete this trial. There are still witnesses we'd like the court to hear, particularly regarding the systemic issues that led to Mr. Washington's circumstances." The judge nodded, something like respect flickering in his eyes. "Very well. We'll continue tomorrow morning." As court adjourned, Clara was approached by reporters seeking comments. With the poise of someone who had spent years advocating for marginalized clients, she reframed the narrative away from just her father's case. This trial has become about more than one man's innocence. It's about acknowledging a pattern of injustice that has affected thousands of veterans of color and continues today. My father is not asking for special treatment. He's asking for the recognition and support he and others earned through their service, but were denied because of their race. Outside the courthouse, the divided crowds had begun finding unexpected common ground. A group of Vietnam veterans, some white and some black, shared stories near the steps. The racial divisions that had seemed so impenetrable during their service years, softened by time and shared understanding of what they'd all endured. Younger activists listened respectfully, drawing connections to contemporary issues. Even some who had come to counter-protest found their positions evolving as they heard first-hand accounts from veterans who had experienced the discrimination being described in court. That evening, as Marcus and Clara shared a quiet dinner in her home, the first time he had sat at her table in 15 years, she asked him how he felt about the day's proceedings. "It's strange," he reflected. "For decades, nobody wanted to hear these truths. Now suddenly, everyone's listening. I just wonder why it took so long." Clara reached across the table to take his hand. "Sometimes the right moment for truth comes late, but it still matters that it comes." As they talked, the television in the background showed news coverage of the trial. A reporter was interviewing Judge Hargrove's clerk, who revealed that the judge had been up all night researching military records and reviewing historical documents about the treatment of black veterans after Vietnam. The clerk described finding the judge at dawn still in yesterday's clothes, surrounded by papers, and looking like a man who'd had his foundation shaken. Marcus watched the report thoughtfully. He's wrestling with more than just this case. He's re-examining everything he thought he knew about his father, about me, about himself. Clara nodded. That's how change happens. One person at a time, facing uncomfortable truths. As they prepared for the next day in court, neither could have predicted how dramatically those truths would reshape not just Marcus's case, but the systems that had failed him and countless others for more than half a century. The fourth day of trial opened with a packed courtroom and an atmosphere of heightened expectation. News of the case had spread nationally, with major networks covering what commentators were calling a landmark examination of systemic racism in military and veterans affairs. Judge William Hargrove entered, looking transformed, not physically but in his demeanor. Gone was the stern, detached jurist who had presided over the first day. In his place was a man who appeared both more humble and more determined, as if overnight he had shed a lifetime of assumptions and now faced the world with new eyes. Jessica Chen called her first witness of the day, Professor James Montgomery from Howard University's Department of Sociology. An expert on institutional racism, Montgomery presented compelling evidence of how seemingly neutral policies had disproportionately harmed black veterans. The GI Bill of 1944 is often celebrated as having created the American middle class, he testified, but its implementation was anything but colorblind. While the law itself contained no racial provisions, its benefits were administered locally, allowing discrimination to flourish, especially in housing and education. Montgomery displayed statistical data showing how black veterans had been systematically excluded from the suburban housing boom, relegated to redlined neighborhoods where property values stagnated or declined. These weren't individual acts of prejudice, he emphasized. This was structural discrimination encoded in federal guidelines, bank lending practices, and zoning laws. Judge Hargrove, who had once dismissed such arguments as excuses for personal failure, now listened intently, asking thoughtful questions that surprised observers accustomed to his previous skepticism about structural racism. The next witness was Dr. Rachel Goldman, a VA psychiatrist specializing in combat trauma. She explained how PTSD from Vietnam had been particularly devastating for black veterans like Marcus. These men faced a double trauma, she testified. First, from combat experiences that were often more dangerous than those of their white counterparts, and second, from returning to a society that both rejected their service and subjected them to continued racial hostility. Dr. Goldman reviewed Marcus's medical history, noting multiple attempts to seek treatment that were either delayed or denied. Mr. Mester. Washington's records show classic symptoms of severe PTSD that went essentially untreated for decades. Had he received timely and appropriate care, his life trajectory could have been dramatically different. Throughout this testimony, Marcus sat straight-backed beside Jessica, his expression dignified, despite the painful experiences being laid bare. Clara, seated directly behind him, occasionally reached forward to touch his shoulder in silent support. When Jessica finally called Marcus himself to testify, a hushed anticipation fell over the courtroom. At 72, he moved slowly to the witness stand, but his bearing remained military precise. After being sworn in, he faced the court with the same courage he had once shown in combat. Jessica began gently. Mr. Washington, can you tell the court about your return home from Vietnam in 1971? Marcus's deep voice carried clearly as he recounted his homecoming, not to parades or gratitude, but to a country still deeply divided by race and increasingly hostile to Vietnam veterans. I came back to Philadelphia wearing my uniform and ribbons. At the airport, a white woman called me a baby killer. On the bus home, the driver wouldn't let me sit in the front, even though I was in uniform. He described attempting to use his GI Bill benefits to attend community college, only to be told repeatedly that his paperwork was incomplete or missing. Similar barriers arose when he applied for VA housing loans. The white veteran ahead of me in line had his application approved on the spot. Mine was always complicated and needed further review. After the third rejection, I understood what was happening. Marcus testified about working a series of low-wage jobs while battling untreated PTSD about nightmares and flashbacks that made steady employment difficult, about turning to alcohol briefly before fighting his way back to sobriety. He spoke of his marriage to Clara's mother, their struggles, and his eventual choice to leave, rather than subject his family to his deteriorating mental state. "The hardest decision I ever made was walking away from my daughter," he said, his voice finally breaking. "But I thought I was protecting her from what I'd become." The courtroom was utterly silent as Marcus continued describing decades of systematic neglect by the very institutions meant to support veterans. He detailed nights in shelters when beds were available and on the streets when they weren't. He explained how the medal, Lieutenant Hargrove's medal, had been his one constant companion, a reminder of both heroism and promises unfulfilled. When Marcus finished his direct testimony, Richard Hoffman rose for cross-examination, but his heart clearly wasn't in it. After a few perfunctory questions, he yielded the floor. Judge Hargrove, however, had questions of his own. "Mr. Washington." He began, his voice uncharacteristically gentle. "You testified that you tried to deliver my father's medal to his family in 1975. Can you tell me exactly what happened that day?" Marcus met the judge's gaze directly. "I wore my dress uniform, sir, thinking it might help your mother take me seriously. When she opened the door, she took one look at me, and her expression changed. When I explained who I was and mentioned your father, she called me a liar and used a racial slur I won't repeat in this courtroom." Judge Hargrove nodded, as if this confirmed something he already knew. "And you left the medal in our mailbox?" "Yes, sir, along with the letter your father wrote to you. 2 days later, they were returned to my address with a note saying not to contact your family again." The judge removed his glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Thank you for your honesty, Mr. Washington. You may step down." As the day progressed, Jessica presented her final witnesses, including housing advocates, who detailed how homelessness disproportionately affected veterans of color, and experts, who explained the long-term economic impacts of the atomic benefits denied to black veterans. By late afternoon, it was clear that what had begun as a simple trespassing case had evolved into a comprehensive examination of systemic racism and institutional failure. In a surprising development, Officer Blake Peterson requested to take the stand again. Judge Hargrove allowed it, though his skeptical expression suggested limited patience. Peterson, clearly feeling cornered by the case's evolution, attempted to defend his actions, but quickly lost composure under Jessica's focused cross-examination. "Look, I was just doing my job," he snapped. "These people are always causing problems, always wanting special treatment because of something that happened 50 years ago." "These people?" Jessica asked quietly. "Who exactly do you mean by these people, Officer Peterson?" The officer realized his mistake too late. "I meant homeless people. Trespassers," he backpedaled unconvincingly. Jessica displayed internal emails from the West Side Development Corporation showing that the company had specifically targeted the undesirable elements, mostly homeless black men, sleeping in their building before an upcoming black men inspection. One email specifically requested increased police patrols to clean up the area and get those people out of sight. As Peterson's testimony unraveled, Judge Hargrove's expression darkened. When the officer made a dismissive comment about playing the race card, the judge interrupted sharply. "Officer Peterson, this court has heard extensive evidence of systematic discrimination, supported by historical records, statistical analysis, and expert testimony. Characterizing this as playing a card is both disrespectful and disingenuous." The reprimand silenced the officer, who left the stand looking defeated. As the final hours of testimony concluded, Judge Hargrove called both attorneys to the bench. "This case has expanded far beyond its original scope," he observed. "Mr. Washington stands charged with minor offenses, but what we've really been examining is a system that failed him and countless others like him." He looked directly at Marcus. "Mr. Washington, I believe you have something that belongs to me." Marcus approached the bench, reaching into his pocket to withdraw the silver star. "Your father wanted you to have this, Your Honor. His last words were about you." Judge Hargrove stared at the metal, emotions warring visibly on his face. "When I was growing up, my mother told me my father died a hero, but she never had a medal to show me. She said it was lost in action." Marcus held out the decoration. "I'm not returning it to Lieutenant Hargrove's son anymore. I'm presenting it to a judge who must decide what justice really means in this courtroom." The symbolic weight of the moment was lost on no one present. As Judge Hargrove carefully took the medal, a subtle shift seemed to occur. Not just in the case, but in the very foundation of how justice might be administered in that courtroom going forward. "Court will recess until tomorrow morning, when I will deliver my ruling," the judge announced, his voice steady, despite the emotion evident in his eyes. As the courtroom cleared, Jessica gathered her papers, turning to Marcus and Clara. "In all my years practicing law, I've never seen anything like this," she admitted. "A case that began with trespassing has put the entire system on trial." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe that's what needed to happen. Not just for me, but for all the others who never got their day in court." That night, as Marcus Washington prepared for whatever the next day might bring, he felt a weight lifting. Not just the physical burden of the medal he'd carried for 55 years, but the heavier burden of unacknowledged truth. Whatever Judge Hargrove decided, Marcus had finally fulfilled his promise to Lieutenant Robert Hargrove. The truth about that day in the jungle, about the systematic discrimination that followed, about the medal and the man who earned it, all of it had finally been spoken aloud in the very room where his son administered justice. For Marcus Washington, that itself was a form of victory half a century in the making. The courtroom fell silent as Judge William Hargrove entered for the final day of proceedings. He carried with him not only the customary legal documents, but also a small velvet box containing his father's silver star. The medal, tarnished by decades, yet unmistakably precious, had spent the night on the judge's desk as he worked through the early morning hours, drafting what he knew would be the most significant ruling of his career. Marcus Washington sat at the defense table, Clara and Jessica flanking him like sentinels. Across the aisle, Richard Hoffman looked resigned, while Officer Blake Peterson's chair remained conspicuously empty, the officer having called in sick after his disastrous testimony the previous day. "Before I deliver my ruling," Judge Hargrove began, "I want to address something personal." He opened the velvet box, removing the silver star that had connected him and Marcus Washington across 5 decades. "Yesterday, I received my father's medal and learned the true story of his heroism. Not from family lore or official records, but from the man who witnessed his final act of courage." The judge's voice remained steady, but those closest to the bench could see the emotion in his eyes. "I also learned how Mr. Washington attempted to fulfill my father's dying wish by delivering this medal to me as a child. He was rejected, dismissed, and denigrated for no reason other than the color of his skin by my own mother." A murmur passed through the courtroom as Judge Hargrove continued. "This personal revelation has forced me to confront uncomfortable truths not only about my family history, but about the assumptions that have guided my own thinking and judicial philosophy. I have prided myself on being a strict-by-the-book judge who treats everyone equally. What I failed to recognize was that treating people equally in a system that is fundamentally unequal does not produce justice. It merely perpetuates injustice in a different form." The judge turned his attention to the legal matters at hand. Regarding the charges against Marcus Washington, this court finds the defendant not guilty on all counts. He proceeded to systematically dismantle each charge, citing the body camera evidence that contradicted Officer Peterson's testimony, the discriminatory enforcement of trespassing laws against homeless individuals, and the complete lack of evidence for the stolen property allegation regarding the medal. But Judge Hargrove wasn't finished. In an unprecedented move, he continued with what amounted to a judicial indictment of the systems that had failed Marcus and countless others. This court cannot, in good conscience, simply dismiss these charges without acknowledging the broader failures they represent. Mr. Washington did not end up homeless and on trial because of personal failings. He stands before us today because our nation failed to honor its commitments to those who served, particularly those of color. Judge Hargrove detailed the evidence presented about discriminatory implementation of GI Bill benefits, VA housing loans, and mental health services. He cited the statistical disparities in how military awards were distributed and the long-term economic impacts of these systematic inequities. Therefore, he continued, in addition to finding the defendant not guilty, this court is taking the extraordinary step of issuing the following orders. First, he announced an investigation into Officer Blake Peterson's conduct and the broader pattern of discriminatory enforcement within the police department. Second, he directed the city to conduct a comprehensive review of its policies regarding homeless veterans with specific attention to racial disparities in services and enforcement. Third, he ordered the Westside Development Corporation to fulfill its contractual obligations to develop affordable housing or return the property to city control. Finally, he made a personal commitment to establish a specialized veterans court within the county system to address the unique needs of former service members entangled in the criminal justice system. As Judge Hargrove concluded his ruling, he addressed Marcus directly. "Mr. Washington, this court owes you an apology, not just for these unwarranted charges, but for the decades of injustice that preceded them. No ruling I can issue today can restore what was taken from you, but perhaps it can begin to address the systemic failures that brought you here." He held up the silver star. "My father's last wish was for you to deliver this medal to me. Today I return it to you for safekeeping until a proper ceremony can be arranged to honor both your service and his sacrifice." The courtroom erupted in applause, which the judge allowed to continue for several moments before gently restoring order. In the days that followed, Marcus Washington's case catalyzed changes that rippled far beyond the Philadelphia courthouse. Former Judge Miranda Reynolds, inspired by the outcome, established the Reynolds-Washington Legal Foundation to help veterans of color access their rightful benefits and address historical inequities in the system. With funding from sympathetic donors and pro bono support from major law firms, the foundation quickly became a powerful force for institutional reform. Officer Blake Peterson faced suspension and a thorough investigation that uncovered a pattern of racial profiling in his arrests. The inquiry expanded to include other officers with similar records, eventually leading to department-wide reforms in training and accountability. The Westside Development Corporation, facing public backlash and legal scrutiny, partnered with veterans housing advocates to convert their abandoned building into affordable apartments with priority placement for homeless veterans. Marcus moved into Clara's home temporarily while he received proper medical and psychological treatment for the first time. The VA, under pressure from the publicity surrounding the case, expedited his long-delayed benefits and connected him with specialists in geriatric PTSD care. Father and daughter began the delicate work of rebuilding their relationship, finding that the painful past could coexist with a more hopeful future. 3 months after the trial concluded, a special ceremony was held at the Philadelphia Veterans Memorial. There, in front of hundreds of veterans, activists, and community members, Marcus Washington was finally awarded the Medal of Honor that had been denied to him 55 years earlier. The medal was presented by none other than Judge William Hargrove, who had become an unexpected ally in the fight for veterans' justice. In his acceptance speech, Marcus spoke about courage in its many forms. In Vietnam, courage meant running toward danger to save your brothers. Today, courage means acknowledging painful truths and working to right historical wrongs. Both kinds of courage are necessary for our nation to heal. The ceremony concluded with Marcus and Judge Hargrove standing side by side, the judge holding his father's silver star, while Marcus wore the long-overdue Medal of Honor. The image became iconic, appearing on magazine covers and social media feeds as a powerful symbol of reconciliation and delayed justice. 1 year later, the changes sparked by the case had taken root and flourished. Marcus, no longer homeless, divided his time between living with Clara's family and traveling the country speaking to students and community groups about his experiences. His quiet dignity and remarkable forgiveness made him an effective bridge builder across racial and generational divides. Judge Hargrove, transformed by his encounter with Marcus and the truths revealed during the trial, became a leading judicial voice for reform. His veterans court model was being replicated in jurisdictions across the country, and his forthright acknowledgement of his own evolving understanding of systemic racism inspired other judges to re-examine their approaches. Clara expanded her work at the VA to develop specialized programs for elderly veterans of color, ensuring that others like her father wouldn't fall through the cracks of a system not designed with their needs in mind. Jessica Chen, whose determined advocacy had helped bring Marcus's case to national attention, became a sought-after speaker on legal approaches to addressing historical inequities. The medal that had connected Marcus and Judge Hargrove across 55 years of separation was eventually donated to the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture, accompanied by both men's stories. The exhibit became one of the museum's most visited. A testament to the power of truth, however, delayed to illuminate injustice and inspire change. On the anniversary of the trial's conclusion, Marcus visited the refurbished apartment building where he had once sought shelter as a homeless man. Now named Hargrove Washington Veterans Housing, it provided safe, dignified homes for 24 formerly homeless veterans. As he walked through the halls greeting residents who had followed paths similar to his own, Marcus reflected on the strange journey that had brought him to this moment. Sometimes justice arrives late, he told a young veteran who asked about his story. But when it does, it creates possibilities for others that we can't even imagine. The young man, an Iraq veteran who had struggled with his own transition to civilian life, nodded in understanding. "You change things for all of us," he said simply. Marcus smiled and shook his head. "Not me alone. It took a judge willing to reconsider everything he thought he knew. It took a daughter who never completely gave up hope. It took lawyers and activists and community members all deciding that the old ways weren't good enough anymore." He looked around at the building that had once been his desperate shelter and was now a home for veterans finding their way back. That's how real change happens. Not from one case or one person, but from all of us, recognizing our connection to each other's stories. What do you think about Judge Hargrove's transformation in this story? Has someone in your life ever completely changed their perspective after learning an important truth? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, please hit that like button to help others find it too. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories of justice, redemption, and the human capacity for change. And if you know a veteran who might be struggling, consider sharing this video as a reminder that it's never too late for recognition and healing. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Your support makes these stories possible. This powerful story reminds us that justice delayed is not necessarily justice denied. Marcus Washington's journey illustrates how systemic racism can impact generations, creating wounds that remain hidden until truth forces them into the light. The transformation of Judge Hargrove demonstrates that even deeply ingrained biases can be overcome when confronted with undeniable truths about our shared humanity. The case reveals how racial discrimination was institutionalized in systems meant to support all veterans, equally creating different Americas for those who served side by side. It shows how individual acts of prejudice like Mrs. Hargrove turning Marcus away can ripple through decades, affecting countless lives. Yet amidst this sobering reality, the story offers hope. It shows that reconciliation becomes possible when we acknowledge historical wrongs rather than denying them. It demonstrates how a single case can catalyze systemic change when enough people recognize injustice and commit to addressing it. Perhaps most importantly, Marcus Washington's dignity throughout his ordeal reminds us that true heroism takes many forms. Sometimes it's carrying a wounded comrade through enemy territory. Other times it's maintaining your humanity despite decades of mistreatment, or finding the courage to face uncomfortable truths about your family and yourself. Ultimately, this story teaches us that healing begins with honesty, continues with accountability, and flourishes with compassion. What biases might you be carrying that deserve reconsideration? Has someone in your life ever shown the kind of quiet dignity that Marcus Washington displayed throughout his struggles? Share your thoughts in the comments section below. If this story moved you, please hit the like button to help others find it too. These powerful narratives of justice and reconciliation deserve to be heard, especially when they highlight the ongoing struggle against racial discrimination in America. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that illuminate hidden histories and inspire positive change. By sharing this video, you could help someone recognize injustice in their own community, or find the courage to stand up against discrimination they witness. Thank you for taking this journey with us. Your support makes it possible for us to continue bringing these important stories to light. Remember, understanding our past is essential to creating a more equitable future for everyone, regardless of race or background.